Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emily Singer-Lucio, and I am the ADA 504 coordinator for the University of Maryland. Thank you all for coming today. I am going to be sharing with you information about how to make your events and meetings accessible for everyone. So the things I am going to talk about today include event location, the audio and visual aspects, interpreting and transcribing, seating, dietary restrictions, which some people don't always think about, service animals and emotional support animals, alternative print formats, web-based meetings, and publicity, including websites. So let's talk a little bit about the event location. First and foremost, you want to make sure that all meetings and events are scheduled in accessible rooms when possible. If for any reason a non-accessible meeting room is chosen and the sponsor receives a request for an individual with a disability, what I would suggest you do is just make every effort to work with the respective room scheduler to find an alternative location that is accessible. And one of the things that's important when looking at room event space is not only for your attendees, but also anybody who's coming to present or speak at your event. You always want to ask them if they need accommodations as well, and see if they may need access to a stage or platform or something like that because they use a wheelchair. Also making sure to be aware of parking. Is there disability parking along the path of travel to the facility? And is the path of travel, the main path of travel to the entrance to the facility accessible? If not, is there an alternative route and is it well marked? Also, you want to look at your entrances. Are there automatic doors on the exterior entrances? Look at the setup of your meeting room. If it's a fixed seating, are there areas for wheelchairs? Can the room setup be modified to allow for room for a wheelchair without creating a fire hazard? One of the things that I've seen done before, especially if you have the flexibility to set the room up however you want, if you do rows of seating with chairs, what I suggest you do is just space them a little bit farther apart so that there is room in some rows for a wheelchair to get in. Leave a chair off the end of some of the rows so that a wheelchair could scoot in there very easily. Obviously, in these days of COVID, spreading things apart is probably preferable to some people anyway. So that's something very easy to do. Don't just stick them in the back or in the front, or making sure that there's a path of travel that they're not going to block. You want to make sure that they're integrated into the setting as much as possible. Restrooms, you want to make sure that there are ADA compliant accessible restrooms located near your event. Audio visual, when putting on an event, so the organizer has a responsibility under the ADA to furnish appropriate auxiliary aids and services when necessary to ensure effective communication with individuals with disabilities. So some examples of that are assistive listening devices. Sometimes big lecture halls will have assistive listening device built into their AV system, and you can always ask if that's already there. That way, if somebody comes with their own FM system, can it connect to that? If not, you may need two FM system devices, one for the speaker and then one for the person who is deaf or hard of hearing. So you want to look into that. If you're doing any video, please make sure it's captioned. That's always the best thing to do. And just as a side note, YouTube, if you're showing a YouTube video, it does have automatic captioning as an audio on the videos. If you purchase the video, please always try and purchase one that has captioning built in. Otherwise, it has to be transcribed to add captioning, and that can be pretty expensive. If you have interpreters at the event and you're showing a video and it does not have captioning, one of the things you want to think about is letting the interpreter see the video first so that they know a little bit about what they have to interpret. The other thing is if you're going to dim the lights and you have an interpreter there, then the interpreter is not going to be able to be seen. So you want to make sure to have some light on the interpreter if they have to do the interpreting of the video. But it is very difficult for an interpreter to just cold do interpreting of a video. If the presentation includes a PowerPoint, every effort should be made to describe and or read what is on the slide for any participant who is blind. And if appropriate, you can consider sending a Word version of documents or of the PowerPoint to the person who's blind or low vision in advance. And that way they can read through it. interpreting or transcribing. You can work with Access and Disability Services to reserve interpreters and transcribers once you have a date for your event. And I put the link in the slides. You want to make a note of the cancellation policy. One of the things that I highly recommend is that as soon as you have your event planned, go ahead and reserve an interpreter, even if you don't know if you're going to need one. It is 10 times easier to make a reservation for an interpreter in advance than it is to try and scramble to find one at the last minute. But as I said, you want to keep note of the cancellation policy. In the event that you don't get a request for one, you want to know when you can cancel without being charged, because if you cancel after that date, you will be charged, and you want to try and avoid that. So when you're reserving transcribers or interpreters, make sure you know the date and time of the event, the location, and the structure of the program. Is it one speaker? Is it multiple speakers? Is it a lecture? Is it discussion, slides, breakout sessions? The more information like that you can provide the interpreters, the better. So, but some best practices when working with interpreters and transcribers, you want to try and get as much program information, including an agenda with the names and copies of any speeches, to the interpreter at least 2 to 3 days in advance. It's always anticipated that there's going to be last minute changes, and so adjustments can be made easily. But again, the more information the interpreters have in advance, the better, especially if there's a lot of terminology that's being used that they may not be familiar with. It gives them a chance to figure out how to best sign those words. Also keep in mind that interpreters are part of your stage setup. So if you have 2 interpreters, you want to always have 2 chairs, and if appropriate, a music stand. If there's a script of any kind, or if they have information that they need to put down in front of them, especially if they're doing names. If they have to sign names, they usually like to have a list of those names in front of them with the accurate spellings so that they know how to spell them. And as I said, also keep in mind with the light, if you're going to dim the lights in any way, they should be in a lit area. They also need to be placed near the speaker to ensure visibility. It's often helpful if you can provide them a wireless headset connected to the speaker's microphone. That will enable the interpreter to hear the speaker more effectively, especially for very large events. Interpreters, as I said, should be in well-lit areas and easily seen. Keep in mind that when the lights go off, as I mentioned, the participant who is deaf no longer has access to the information. Transcribers should be seated in a location where they can best hear the speaker. A wireless headset connected to the speaker's microphone will enable the transcriber to hear the speaker more effectively. So if you're going to have screens in your event to broadcast the video of the event, you can work with the transcriber to have the captioning go at the bottom of the screen as well. Seating. So for individuals who attend your event who need a sign language interpreter, I always highly recommend that you reserve some seating in the front, nearest where the interpreter is going to be, so that they can easily see the interpreter. For guests who use a wheelchair, you want to be able to sit comfortably with your friends and companions. So make sure that when you think about wheelchair seating, you also think about reserving seating next to them for their friends. As I mentioned earlier, that you want to make sure the path of travel to all the amenities is clear of obstructions, and aisles between chairs and tables could be at least 36 inches wide. That would make it accessible for a wheelchair. And also, as I mentioned earlier, if you also want to look at the stage access. There also, don't just think about people with wheelchairs. There also may be people who are ambulatory but limited mobility that may not be able to walk up and down stairs. If you're doing your event in an auditorium style room where there are stairs, make sure to reserve some seats near the top where the entrance is, or the bottom where the entrance is, so that people don't have to walk up or down a lot of stairs. On the end of the aisles is recommended. If there are different levels of seating, ideally it's the best option if you can provide seating in each area. What I mean by that is, so if you go to a huge arena sporting event of some sort, and you've got different levels of seating in the 100 level section, 200 level section, 300 level section, 400 level section, it's usually best if you can have wheelchair seating in each of those sections to be equal to what everybody else has in terms of options. If you are serving food at your event, we want to talk about dietary restrictions. Oftentimes people think about vegetarian, more and more people are thinking about vegan, but we also want to make sure to include gluten-free options available. What you can do is put in a statement in your publicity materials requesting that individuals with specific dietary needs contact the organizer to discuss options that may be provided. This could be kosher options, or as I said, vegetarian, vegan, gluten, or something else. But at least if you put a statement in there saying that you're welcome to them contacting you, it's a very welcoming. It's very welcoming to the person who needs that as an accommodation. We are seeing more and more service animals around campus, and so under the ADA, a service animal is defined as a dog that has been individually trained to do work or perform tasks for an individual with a disability. The tasks performed by the dog must be directly related to the person's disability. If you ever have a question as to the legitimacy of a service animal, there are two questions that the law allows you to ask. One is the dog a service dog required because of a disability? And what work or tasks has the dog been trained to perform? You as an individual may not request any documentation for the dog, require that the dog demonstrate its task, or inquire the nature of the person's disability. Also, this comes as kind of a surprise to people, but the ADA does not require service animals to wear a vest, ID tag, or specific harness. So when you want to think about emotional support animals, typically emotional support animals are animals that stay with individuals in residence halls or home. However, there are occasions when people need to bring their emotional support animal with them. Think about people with PTSD or other types of traumatic experiences. These are animals that have not been trained to perform a specific job or task, and they do not qualify as a service animal under the ADA. They are to go through the accommodations process and provide appropriate documentation. So that you would either go through, if it's a student, you would go through ADS. If it's an employee or staff, you would go through UHR. In the event another person attending the event has a severe allergy to a service animal or an emotional support animal, you want to do your best to determine how to allow both individuals to attend and find a reasonable solution. And I do realize that sometimes these things come up at the very last minute on the day of the event. And so what I can suggest is you want to use your best judgment and try and work with both individuals as best you can. So we do ask that all print materials be available in an alternative format, and that's a lot easier actually than sometimes people think it is. If you know in advance, you can offer alternatives to see what will work best for an individual. You can email them a copy. You can just increase the font size and print out a large print. Sometimes they need Braille. That's not requested quite as often. But if it is, it does require some time to get made into Braille, and you can work with ADS or UHR or my office to try and find an appropriate place to get Braille printed. I always recommend the day of the event to have a few large print copies available. People always say, well, I've printed them and no one ever asked for them. So here's a key to solve that problem. Make sure that everybody on your team who is handing out programs or whatever other materials is aware that large print copies exist and who has them and where to go get them. You can also print it in your program that large print copies are available at entrance such and such, or with one of the ushers or whoever that you need to contact. But the more you spread the word about that, the more likely people will pick that out. The other thing is that you can also just keep an eye out for people who you suspect might need them and say, just letting you know if you need it, we have a large print copy available of our program. You may not always be right, but you want to just obviously be careful how you say it, but you can also let people know that those are available if you think they might need it. So how do you make documents accessible? To ensure equal access to information about programs and events, here are some guidelines that I recommend. You want to maintain a final copy of your program in an MS Word document. That is the easiest thing to convert. You want to try to avoid using images unless you can put an alt tag description on the electronic version. Don't use text boxes or frames. And I know it's hard to get away from text boxes or frames, but those are not screen reader accessible. You also want to include a statement in the text that the publication is available in alternative formats upon request, and make sure to supply contact information so people know who to contact. With finished print publications, when you're fulfilling requests for alternative formats, it is the responsibility of the department or the office for which the publication was produced. So here are some procedures. You want to maybe designate a specific person to handle requests for publications in an alternative format so they know what steps to take. As I said, the preferred format for alternative format publications to be emailed as text only or Microsoft Word files, which the requester can print out in whatever size he or she needs. If someone requests materials in Braille, as I mentioned earlier, you'll need to work with someone to produce those materials. If a requester cannot receive emails or requests a copy in large print, all you have to do is increase the font size as requested. And sometimes you may need to reorient the copy, so vertical to horizontal, for example, and you can send a copy to the requester or provide a reserved copy at the event. Here are some resources for making large print. One is the American Council for the Blind, and the other is Designing for Screen Reader Compatibility. Oftentimes we're using PowerPoint these days. So again, you want to make sure that your PowerPoint is easily readable by people with vision issues. So try and stay away from serif font. So use sans serif font that's at least 18 point, 22 is preferred. Use a light colored background with a dark text. Use a plain background without any watermark, photo, or design behind the text. Use a PowerPoint theme to structure your presentation with only short sentences or bulleted phrases, about 4 lines of text, 40 words per slide. And I got to tell you, I have a really hard time with that. So I know that's a challenge depending on some of the topics, but do your best. Make sure to read and describe things on your PowerPoint during a live presentation. I know oftentimes we think, okay, everyone's just going to read it, so I'm not going to read it. But keep in mind there may be somebody in your audience who can't read it. And so for them, you do want to make sure to read everything on your slide. You want to keep it short. As a rule, 1 slide for every 2 minutes of speaking time. Photographs, images, clip art, graphics, maps, and charts cannot be read by screen readers. So you want to, embed alt text or long descriptions with images and other graphic elements. It's interesting, if you're on Facebook, you may see more and more people doing this. I tend to see it just because of my field, and there's a lot of people on my Facebook friends who are in this field. But whenever they post pictures or images of whatever it is, they're starting to put captions and descriptions of the picture in their posts for people who can't see them. Making your PowerPoint or Google Slides accessible. Our IT department has a really good resource on that, and I've provided the link here. You can also go to the ADA Mid-Atlantic Center. They have a webinar for empowering PowerPoint to make it accessible. So when you do a web-based meeting, I suggest you have a checklist. So the accessibility of your webinars will always begin and end with the webinar platform you are using. If the program is not accessible or does not include certain integrated features, your ability to provide access will be limited. So make sure whether you're using Zoom or whatever platform you're using that it does have accessibility built in, and that you can turn those features on. Before committing to a webinar platform, there are a few things that you should check to ensure that you'll be able to provide access during the virtual events. Is the platform compliant with Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act or WCAG Act 2.0, which is what we use right now with website design and standards? Does the platform have an option to provide live integrated captioning? So Zoom has this option. If you're using something else like Chime or WebEx or something else, you want to always make sure that they have that available. Other features of the platform that could help you identify if it is compliant include accessibility of all features of the program through keyboard shortcuts without the use of a mouse, keyboard commands that allow the user to move between multiple windows on the computer, the capacity to resize the captions, change the color of the text and the font, and the flexibility to move the captioning to different locations on the screen. Your participants may have individual access needs, and this allows them to adjust the captioning to meet their needs. Non-auditory alerts to communicate with participants. Examples of these alerts could be an icon of a raised hand, a chat box to communicate with the webinar host, or whiteboards to write notes to all participants. The ability to record or save any materials, including captioning for later review. This allows anyone to access the materials in the same format that it was delivered and at their own pace. And also the option for screen reader users to interact with all the program functions. Similarly, those who do not use screen readers. So examples include using polling or chat features, featuring features specific for presenters, and the ability to read across lines in the registration or other materials. If you use polling, make sure that aspect is accessible. That is critically important. So publicizing events, this is where it all starts. I always recommend that the event organizers place an accessibility notice in the materials announcing the event. That's the first thing you can do and the most important. You also want to make sure the accessibility notice includes electronics communication such as email, website, print materials. So if you do a banner or a poster or a flyer or a postcard website, always make sure it has an accessibility statement on there. The text must include the name and contact information for the individual, division, unit, or group to contact for accommodations. Often people think, oh, I should put the ADA office as the person to contact. That's not true. So if you're hosting the event, you are the person who should be listed as that, as the person to contact. And I've put here a couple suggestions, which I'll read in a second. But the reason for that is that you're the person who's going to be able to say, oh, so tell me what kind of accommodations you need. I can tell you more about the event. I can tell you if I can send you the copy of the program in advance. What can I do to work with you? If you're still not sure, you can always reach out to me or to ADS and we can work with you. So I gave you two suggestions. One's a longer version statement and one's a shorter version statement. The longer one says to please contact the event organizer and put your phone number and email at least 1 week prior to the event to request reasonable accommodations. And remember, I said earlier that it's important that you know the cutoff deadline for interpreters if you're not going to need any. And so you may need to adjust that 1 week prior based on their deadline. However, in all situations, a good faith effort up until the time of the event will be made to provide accommodations. This is really critically important. Even if you don't get a request for an accommodations in the time frame you suggest, if someone calls you or reaches out to you the day before the event or even the day of the event, we really need to make a good faith effort to see if we can accommodate this person. It's not reasonable for us to say, sorry, no, you missed the deadline, we can't do anything. We at least have to make a good faith effort. And if we can, that would be great. And if we can't, we just need to explain to the person that, we are going to do everything we can to try and make it accessible for you, but we may not be able to given the late date, okay? So the short notice is for disability accommodations, please contact the event organizer at phone and email. It is not necessary to include accessibility notices and communications regarding routine or standing meetings for small groups of individuals when none of the individuals is in need of accommodation, especially if you know the group attending. So like if there's a student org that has a regular meeting or a department that has a regular meeting, you don't need to necessarily do that. So when you're building web applications or websites to announce and register for your event, you should make sure your website applications are accessible. So each site should adhere to the following guidelines. Choose a content management system that supports accessibility. Use headings correctly to organize the structure of your content. Include proper alt tags for images. Give all links unique and descriptive names. Make sure if you're doing a registration page that you use color appropriately. Design all the forms for accessibility. Use tables for tabular data, not for layout. Ensure that all content can be accessed with the keyboard alone in a logical way, and use ARIA roles and landmarks, but only when necessary. So ARIA is accessible rich internet applications, is a complex, powerful technical specification for adding accessibility information to elements that are not natively accessible. So make sure you look at all that. And again, the IT department can also help with that. Here are some resources for making websites accessible. You can test your website through Site Improve, which is something that University of Maryland has. You can also look at the W3C Web Accessibility Initiative. There's a lot of resources there. They also have tutorials. And WebAIM also has a resource on creating accessible forms. I gave you some other resources here on just in accessible meeting events in general, how to make meetings accessible, events and conferences guide, a planning guide to making temporary events accessible, planning accessible meetings and events, a toolkit. And then there's a link for adahospitality.org, which has a really good conferences guide. And the 3G, which is what I mentioned before, they have a thing on accessible presentations as well. I wanted to also give you my contact information. This is how you can reach me if you have further questions. I know we went through that pretty quickly, so I wanted to open up the remaining time to questions since we have a good audience. So Allison, if you want to share with me anything in the chat or have people ask their questions, either way, I'm good with that.
Sounds good. Hi, everyone. I'm Allison Dickinson, she, her pronouns. I am the communications person for Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And I'm here just to present your questions, which you can enter in the chat or the Q&A as we continue talking. And I will be asking Emily on your behalf. So the first and most frequent question that I'm getting here is, will you share the slides, or what kind of resources and materials can we give to folks when today is over?
Yes, and we are going to make that accessible. We're going to make the recording with the transcript and the slides available to people who would like it. So yes.
Sounds good. So everyone look forward to getting all of those. Okay, here's a question. I'll just read it off. As the logistics meeting planner and organizer, but not necessarily overseeing the client's content or the speakers or registration, et cetera, right? How much responsibility would I have to ensure that all of these components that you mentioned are in place? Is it really simply a matter of making sure that they're aware of the information, or is there other things to note?
Yeah, so that's a good question. What I would always suggest is that when an event like this is being planned, that there's be some sort of team meeting or organizational meeting to start off with, to sort of walk through all these things. As a side note, I am happy to come to any of those planning meetings and be a fly on the wall and share some of these things with them. But I think that it's good for everybody who's involved in the planning at any stage to know about all these things that they need to be considering in terms of making it accessible. As in your role, I would definitely see as a key person in making sure that this is accessible and working with the department or the other people involved in making sure that the speakers and everyone else is aware of their responsibilities to make it accessible. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks. If that didn't, person that asked that question, you can feel free to pop in a follow-up. I have a couple questions here on some of the web-based tools. One is, what are some good examples of accessible polling tools or other audience response tools, or do you have a list of those?
You know, I don't have a list of those, and that's a great question. It's something I probably should look into. So I don't know, but I can try and do some research and find out. I'm actually going to make a note to that to find out.
Sounds good. We are always learning, and
Yeah.
these resources are always kind of coming up as well. So the person that asked that question said, cool, thanks. Thank you for that. Here's another one. How many of the web-based accessibility options you reviewed are available in the UMD version of Zoom? And do you know if there's a cheat sheet for how to enable those functions if you're the meeting creator?
I honestly don't know. Yeah, I mean, I am relatively new to the institution, so I apologize. But I can certainly work with our IT department to make sure that these things are available through UMD. I know I gave a couple resources that were UMD based, but I honestly, in terms of a cheat sheet, I don't know that one exists.
Okay, that's helpful. Here are some other questions. You mentioned large print. Is there like a standard font size that begins to qualify as large print?
Yeah, there is. Let me, hold on 1 second. Yeah, so it's along the same lines as what I put in terms of the accessible PowerPoint. I said sans serif font that's at least 18.22 is preferred. So that is generally what is considered large print. I can put in the chat, if I can find it quickly, large print guidelines.
Thanks. And I'm seeing Susan Johnston. I feel like I recognize this name from DIT maybe, with a knowledge article for UMD. Oh, well, there we go. It's from IT support. Thanks, Susan.
All right, and I am putting in the chat from the American Council of the Blind about guidelines for large print.
Awesome. That's great. And as someone who works with fonts, sometimes I will add, like, obviously some things are different sizes. So if you're using one of those fonts that's real little, like, let's maybe err on the size of doing something even bigger than that. So, all right. Okay. Sorry, I'm reading this out loud as I'm talking. This person said, sorry if I missed it, but was some of the language we could use so we are inclusive to those with invisible disabilities? So what could we be considering for invisible disabilities? Thanks for that question.
Yeah, so I mean, what we want to do is be inclusive for all disabilities, invisible disabilities and visible disabilities. And so what you always want to do is have a welcoming statement that says, if you need accommodations to attend this event, make sure to contact us so we can be of help to you, because everyone's different. Even two people with the same disability, they may have different needs. So you always want to be able to have a conversation with people and have an interactive process in terms of making sure that their needs get met.
Great, thank you. Seeing more helpful things getting put in the chat, and I will save the chat and can share that out with folks after the fact as well. But you had also mentioned, Emily, screen readers, especially around Zoom, but just generally as an accessibility tool. Do you have like tips on how a person who wants to make sure their content is accessible, like how you could test screen reader functionality? Is that something, something a person could download and try using, or how would you recommend?
So there, again, I don't know if Susan wants to post this, but there is a resource through IT to test it. Well, Site Improve is one of the ones I listed on there, is a way to test your site to see whether your site is accessible, and that would include screen reader accessibility. And that's available through UMD.
Oh, awesome, thanks. And thanks again to Susan for being here. I will say that I am a fan because I've gone to some of the DIT accessibility trainings and found those really helpful. So I will give those a shout out here, and I'll see if I can find the link straight to sign up for some of those, but those have been great. I'm not seeing other questions right now, but folks, if you want to pop them into the Q&A or the chat, we have some time still, so. I'm trying to think if I have others, because I'm always learning. As you all know, I do communications, so I'm helping create some of the graphics and materials and things. So thanks, Leslie. What is the name of that software we're getting in computer labs for accessibility functionality? Do you know this one?
Is that the Panopto one? It may, I don't know what it is. I don't know. I don't know what IT is doing in terms of that.
Okay. Yeah, it's a good question. I know that there's
I mean, I know we have Panopto. Oh no, it's Morphic. That's right.
Oh, I haven't heard of that.
Actually, so Morphic was designed by a UMD office. It's actually a really cool program. I can actually put the link in the chat. Let me just pull it up here. It's actually, I'm going to clue you in on something about Morphic right now. It is free for a lifetime right now if you download it. And at some point in time, there's going to be a cost associated for it. But right now, they're trying to just spread the word about it. I just put the link into the chat for Morphic. But it is a wonderful piece of software.
That's exciting. I'll have to check that one out.
I actually talked to the director who's doing it just the other day. So
nice.
Yeah.
I think this is a Zoom question. What about people who call in and so they can't use chat, for example?
Yeah, well, there is a way to do chat on your phone. You have to know what the keystroke is to do chat, and I don't know what it is because I don't I don't usually call into my phone, but there is a way you can do chat through your phone.
Okay. It's probably one of those like a *6, and I haven't done a ton on my phone
Right.
as well, but that's helpful to know. So that should be accessible for folks.
Right.
Awesome. Keep them coming, people. I'll throw mine in here. And that is in terms of fonts and things, are there, I guess, besides being sans serif, other features that we should be looking out for of like, this is just not going to be super readable?
Well, yeah, I wouldn't use something like Gothic fonts or, you want to use plain text fonts as much as possible. There is a font that you may find called APHONT. It's a font. It was actually designed as a font to be accessible. So if you see that font is available in your list, that's one I would highly recommend.
That's cool. Thank you. I know I was reading about one that was particularly readable for folks with dyslexia, but I don't remember what it's called now. Okay, follow up to the call-in Zoom question. First, I'm seeing a comment that you can download the Zoom app on your phone and talk and chat that way rather than just calling the phone number. And that is true. The follow-up is that the person asking the question was really thinking more about folks who are blind and just call in. So they might not be able to do a chat or a hand raise or some of those other features.
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, there are accessibility features on phones these days that in some cases allow some of that. So you just want to, they may have access to that. But again, you don't always want to assume that they do or don't. So my suggestion is always when a person wants to register for an event is that, for them to call in and ask them, what do you need from us? Here are the things we plan to be using during the event. The more information you know about the event, the structure of the event, and anything taking place, the more help you're going to be to the individual with a disability and helping them know, what they need to navigate the event successfully.
Sure. So maybe less so about a prescribed list of things, which you've definitely given us a lot to think about, but then also just being open to have that conversation.
Absolutely.
With your attendees. Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I get that I would want to plan everything so everything is available and accessible. And then I guess sometimes you want to just be able to dig into it with folks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep.
Feel free to keep asking questions, everybody. While I have this moment here, to also give a shout out to DHHS. I've worked with them. And as Emily, you're talking about giving as much information as possible to like interpreters and captioners before the event. I'm happy to give like my little template that I've used. I think I may overload folks with like different vocabulary words we might use, but thinking this is a very academic space, our events tend to have some specialized vocabulary sometimes that you might just want to be prepared to use. So anyway, shout out to Cassie over at DHHS. She's been really wonderful of getting us captioners when we need them. And that is actually a easier process than you'd think. So, okay, long question here. I'm just going to read it out loud. I have been considering the implications of incorporating activities that require physical movement in events and trainings for people with physical disabilities. For example, doing group work in large classrooms often requires moving around. Additionally, things like putting sticky notes on the wall to do a gallery viewing and activities like that. I do think it can help attendees stay engaged by not sitting still for a 6-hour training. And it allows for a psychomotor outlet during potentially triggering topics. Is there a way to do these in-person activities that is accessible beyond saying that you're not required to participate?
That's a really great question. And the reality is that every event is different and every individual with a disability is different and what their needs are going to be different. So the best thing you can do is plan your event and make a note that you want to try and be as accessible as possible and reach out to people and try and work with them directly, right? Like, so if you're using sticky notes, for example, and you're doing some type of color coded thing, for example, one thing we didn't talk about is somebody who might be colorblind, so maybe if they reach out to you and say, hey, I don't do well with, red sticky note, red paper or whatever, or something that's red. So great. So I'll say, great, I'll stay away from using red. I'll use black marker on, yellow sticky note if that's best for you or whatever. So I think it just requires having a conversation with people. I'm not saying you shouldn't plan an event like that. But I would suggest you always try and say, work with individuals. Keep also in mind that, we don't talk a lot about it, but we also have a lot of students who have social interaction issues with disabilities, right? Who can't handle large group settings, may not be comfortable getting up and moving around and interacting with other people, depending on their, social or emotional state at the time. So, I think it's fine to say, if you're proposing doing an interactive event, think about how people can still fully participate regardless of whether they want to stand up and walk around or stay where they are and still participate. I think that's the critical thing, is just to think outside the box about how other ways people can participate. I'm going to sort of diverge off topic and answer this question a little bit more. Some of you may be familiar with a concept called universal design. Susan's familiar with universal design. And when you're planning an event, you can also sort of incorporate universal design concepts into that to be fully accessible to everybody in all types of disabilities. So if you just Google universal design, you'll find a lot of resources. And I believe, I don't know if Susan wants to put it in the chat, but I think that our IT department also has resources on universal designs, or our teaching and learning center has resources on universal design. But it's a practice you can use in any type of event or teaching model that's helpful.
Thanks for that. And that also, I'm just full of shout outs today, but I'm going to shout out to our ODI newsletter, which is going out tomorrow. It comes out every Wednesday. And Emily has provided a really great article with some tips on how to make, specifically this one's more for instructors and classes, but I think it works for everybody who's planning things, on making those accessible and just thinking about ableism in higher education writ large. So I will pop a little, if you want to subscribe to our newsletter, Emily gives us lots of good resources. And we have, an accessibility tip with some regularity as well. So that is coming out.
Allison, can they get the back issues of it to get all the past tips we've put in there?
Yeah, there's like an archive page as well. Okay, do you have any suggestions for making documents that have multiple languages more accessible?
Yeah, that's a challenge. I mean, again, you want to defer to the person who needs the accommodation, right? I mean, if you need to make it in large print, you just put it, you have to, increase the size. If you might want to just find out what the person's primary language is, so what section of the document you need to make accessible. If they don't speak the other languages that are on the document, then maybe they don't need that.
Thanks. And Armita, feel free to put a follow-up in there if you want to on that. Okay, I have a question for you about event graphics. We had talked about, or you mentioned wanting to have that accessibility contact information or the accommodations statement in any of your materials. So what I'm wondering is the balance between, you don't want to have too much text in your graphic, right? And I do see a lot of like just a full flyer on Twitter, no alt text. Obviously, we want to be avoiding that. Given the nature of Twitter, you're only allowed so many characters, right? So how are you balancing, like, you want to have that information there and you also want your graphic to be accessible without too much alt text? Do you have advice on that one?
I'm going to admit that I am not a Twitter person, so I don't know a whole lot about it. I do know that there's a character limitation, and so you just have to use your best judgment. I would say if you're doing an announcement for an event, just always try and say, something, need accessibility question mark, you know, and then put an email or something. Just as simple as you can, but identifying what it is that's for as best you can. Or
Thanks.
the other option is that if you're going to put a website link that has more information, the website link can have the additional information.
Cool. That's what I've been defaulting to. Certainly open to hearing from our audience as well, because I am learning all this stuff and I want to continue to learn and do better on these things. And then also I've acknowledged there's, you know, some of these technology pieces that just don't want us to win sometimes. So
All right, but I want to say that Susan put in the chat the link to the universal design information that I mentioned earlier.
thank you, Susan. Really coming through for us today. I love it. And DIT has been really wonderful on accessibility. Their, what is it? DIY IT accessibility training has these like top 6 tips of ways you can make documents accessible. And it's awesome. It's, you know, all easier than you think it's going to be, I think is a good takeaway. Yeah. It can sound big and scary, and then it's chunked out in these little pieces, and it's nice.
I do want to say one other thing in terms of planning your event and interpreters. Sometimes that can be scary to people because I know that they cost money. So when you are planning your event, make sure you're budgeting for that. You know, that's important just to keep in the back of your mind if you're going to need interpreters. And Susan just posted the 6 essential steps to IT accessibility.
All right, if we were in a crowd, I'd say let's all give a hand to Susan.
Well, if you're going to be giving a hand to people who are deaf, what you would do is just wave your hands like this. So there you go.
Yeah.
You can do that.
Just gonna save the chat again. I'm seeing a raised hand. Let's see, Abby, do you want to turn your mic on and ask your question? Let's see. I gave permission. We'll see if they pop in. Okay, I'm not super familiar with that feature, so I think we've allowed Abby to speak if Abby wants to have a question. Seeing a thank you in our chat for you as well, Emily. So folks, we do have a few more minutes here if you want to pop questions into the chat. It's your time to get Emily's expertise on all of your event and meeting accessibility questions. So obviously, you're also a great resource at all times.
Thanks, Al. Yeah, if no one else has any questions, I really appreciate everyone coming today. This has been great. I hope this information has been helpful. You know, I'm always happy to talk through any situations of events that people have and work through them with you to see what steps need to be taken to make it accessible.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks, Allison, for your help.